success, wealth, recognition. Gary Cooper had it all, lost it all, then turned a revolutionary discovery into the success paradox. Here's Gary.
My guest is Deborah Lee James, the 23rd Secretary of the Air Force, where she led a force of nearly 660,000 with a budget exceeding $139 billion. Her impressive 30-year career spans both public service and private sector leadership, including roles at the Pentagon and United Technologies. Debbie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Gary. It's great to be with you.
It's so nice to have you. I feel like I should salute or something after hearing all of the things that you've done in your life. It really is amazing.
Well, thank you. It's been a wonderful career, and I'm very grateful that I had a chance to do some of the things I've done.
You know, I'm sure most of the people I interviewed, one of the guys that landed in Sully's plane and, the miracle on the Hudson, and everybody wanted to talk to him about that. I wanted to talk to him about how he became the CEO of the Discovery Channel from a small town out of Greenville. Kind of the same thing with you. How did you become the person you became? How can we inspire people on this podcast today? How can a young woman, who's listening, learn how to, better herself and improve herself? So, where did Debbie come from, and how did you become the person you became?
Well, much like Sully, much like you, Gary, I suspect listeners might think this is a rather unlikely story of, how one becomes the Secretary of the Air Force. But I'll start at the beginning. And the beginning is I grew up in a small town called Rumson, New Jersey. It was a beautiful town near the Jersey shore. In New Jersey, we call it the shore, not the beach. That's how you know we're legitimate New Jersey people.
Okay.
And it was beautiful and very wealthy. And I grew up on what you might call the wrong side of the tracks, meaning my family was not wealthy. And in a community, I'm talking now back in, say, the 1960s, where divorce was not prevalent, my family was divorced. So I don't remember my dad ever living at home. I saw him on weekends, but I was young. And so I grew up in, I'll say, a difficult environment. But I think what young people need to remember is it's not your circumstances that you come from, it's what you choose to do with those circumstances. So I was a good student, and I wanted to go places in life. Literally, I wanted to travel. I wanted to see other parts of the world, other parts of the United States. I had the travel bug early. And I also was very determined. I had one singular dream in my early years, meaning high school, college, grad school. I wanted to be a diplomat. So I worked very hard for that as a young person. I took all the right courses.
At an early age? You knew
At
that?
an early age. I did. I was a very determined young lady. I took languages, I took history, I took politics. I took all the things that I thought would position me well to be a diplomat. And I even in graduate school secured a internship with the State Department. So
that's amazing.
Basically, I thought I had it all, but here comes the first big curveball. Maybe the first curveball was my growing up environment. The second curveball was I applied thinking I had everything going my way, but they didn't pick me for whatever reason.
Is that the Army?
This was the State Department, because you see, in my early days, I had no idea whatsoever about the Army or no idea whatsoever about wanting to be involved with the military. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to be a diplomat. But my dream was not realized, and so I had to pivot. I had to try something else. And the truth is, I took the job with the Army as my first job because it was my only job offer at the time. Sometimes you got to eat. Sometimes you just got to do what you have to do to keep on going and hope for the best. So I tried something that I had never dreamed of trying before. I was a civilian in the Army, not a uniformed person in the Army. And it turns out it was really interesting work. I had a great boss. I fell into a terrific first team of people that cared about me, that I learned from. And I was immediately able to help them in certain ways as a member of the team. So long story short, from that first, what felt like failure, I was able to pivot, bounce back, try something new. And that new thing, which I call my plan B, turned out to be the best thing ever. And before you know it, the job with the Army led to a job on Capitol Hill with one of the defense committees, which then led to a job in the Pentagon. So it truly is one thing led to the next, led to the next. And 35 years later, I became the Secretary of the Air Force. So it was a very unlikely route to the job, never dreamed of having such a job. But it just goes to show that your plan B can turn out way better than your plan A ever could have been.
That's amazing. I heard you in another interview talking about plan A versus plan B versus plan C. And oftentimes I've noticed that failure, and I read a book called Fail Forward. There's been many times in my life where I've failed, but I didn't see myself as a failure. And in this book, that's what it talks about, is most of us that have succeeded, to whatever degree that is, didn't see ourselves as failures, but people who have succeeded just see failure as another chance. Like Michael Jordan is a great example. He said, I can't remember how many times he missed the buzzer beater, but he saw it as an opportunity to practice for the time when the buzzer beater counted. And I heard your interview before, you were like, plan B was the chance for me to fail forward. You didn't describe it that way, but that's exactly what you just said. It led to the Pentagon and led to where you became. One of the things I heard you talk about in another interview was the power of your first boss. You didn't say it like that, but that's what I heard. Who was that boss? What was how that person impacted you? Because when you got to the Army, what happened? Because something really happened there.
Yeah. So my first boss out of school was Major General Bob Berquist. He is now deceased. But not only was he my first boss, I consider him to be my first great mentor in life, or I'll say in my professional life. And why is that so? Because he not only gave me good feedback about my job performance, which, that's kind of table stakes for a boss these days. And even back then, you're supposed to give feedback. But more than that, he cared about me. He asked me, what did I want to do as the next step? In my position at that time, I was able to rotate to other organizations, but still remain paid by the Department of the Army. So he asked me, what did I want to do as the next step? What organization would interest me? And then he set about to try to help me get that. He opened doors for me that I would have never, ever been able to open for myself. Now, of course, you have to walk through that door and you have to demonstrate that you have the capability and the willingness to work hard, et cetera. But you got to get the door open sometimes. And General Berquist did this for me. So if I had landed as my first boss with a terrible situation, I might have pivoted again and not pursued a career in national security. But it was the magic combination of the work was really interesting at the Department of the Army, fantastic first boss that valued me and helped me, and a wonderful team of people, most of whom were men, most of whom were much older than me, and most of whom were uniformed military. Again, I was always a civilian, but they took me under their wing. We had camaraderie. I learned from them, and I felt like they cared about me, and I cared about them.
Yeah, what year was that? Just curiosity.
Now I'm going to date myself, Gary. That was 1981. I was only 4, though. I like to point out I was very precocious as a youngster.
Of course, yeah. I can't imagine it was as friendly or as easy for ladies back then as it is today.
It's not even all that easy today in some circles, but I think it certainly is much easier. And so, again, I say I got super lucky. The old saying, I'd rather be lucky than smart. Well, I was lucky in this case that I just fell in with a tremendously supportive group of people.
It kind of brings me to your book, Aim High. You talked about the power of mentorship and how that worked for you. You fast forwarded, 35 years. You're now mentoring people and paying it forward. So why is that important to you? Why is mentoring important for you now?
Well, you just said it. I have been a great beneficiary of mentorship throughout my life. I've learned a great deal from that. I mean, you talked about how you failed many times, but didn't necessarily see yourself as a failure. I think it comes a little slower for some of us. I will tell you, I felt like a failure, truly a failure, many times.
That's really hard to believe.
With time, of course, I came to believe what I now believe, that even when things don't work out as you hope or anticipate, you can still learn from it. It's not the end of your life. You can go forward, you can go do other things, or you can do the same thing, but do it differently and better. With time, I learned that, and with help from mentors who helped me see it that way. So I think it's important to pay that forward, because there's other slow learners out there like me. And, well, and we need to keep talking to young people or to people who are mid-career, who haven't maybe gotten as far along as we have, to remind them of these lessons and to remind them in an authentic way. And you certainly believes very strongly in that authenticity, that, hey, nobody's perfect. Nobody gets it right all the time. But the most important thing is that from mistakes or things that go wrong, what do you learn from it? How do you bounce forward? How do you keep going and carry it forward?
Well, you talked in Aim High, your book, about this amazing framework. And I'm curious, number one, for you to share the framework to, as much as you want. And two, how the hell did you come up with that?
Well, again, the framework comes with thought and experience and time, and it has come over decades. And it is really, it is a grouping, I'll say, of lessons learned. And how do you put those together into a persuasive, easy to understand type of framework in a book format. So the framework basically that I believe in is, it is up to everybody individually as a professional, as well as leaders of organizations, to chart and navigate your path. So there's various steps that I believe you have to take, meaning, everybody ought to have a plan A, but be prepared to pivot to plan B. And you heard how I learned that lesson. I think it's important to be part of something bigger than yourself. I told you how inspired I was and how I really enjoyed the work at the Department of the Army, and how that floated my boat. I felt like, wow, this little girl from Rumsden, New Jersey is working on important national security issues that are crucial for the nation. And that was way bigger than me. The mentorship is part of charting and navigating your course. Learning, evolving, reinventing yourself at periodic times in your career. That's part of it. So I have different lessons learned. The second part of the framework after chart and navigate is lead and inspire teams, because, it's all about teamwork nowadays. So this gets to the importance of, in order to do that, you have to be a great communicator, which everybody thinks that means you're a great orator, the oral word. And that's true. But being a clear, concise writer is also very important. And at least 50% of effective communication, in my judgment, is effective and deep listening. We don't listen well enough to one another these days.
I know I did not.
It's hard to do sometimes because we're so jumping to what are we going to say as the next increment in the conversation, that we're not really sitting back and internalizing and listening as well as we should. So we have to practice that skill. Putting people first, role modeling ethical behavior. All of this is part of the lead and inspire. And the third piece of my framework is get things done, because, you're not going to be an effective leader of an org, and you're not going to be effective in your own personal and professional life if you don't get things done. And so there's some steps that I think, regardless of what the problem is, the challenge is, you got to investigate it. You got to communicate it to the team. The call to action, so to speak. You got to activate, meaning, okay, we know what the problem is. We've built the communication strategy, so to speak, to get everybody on board. So now what are we going to do differently? That's the activate phase. There's iterate, meaning you got a plan, but no plan is going to be perfect. You're going to have to change things up. Some elements won't work. You have to be prepared to pivot there. That's the iterate phase. And then very importantly is follow-up, because nothing, at least in my life, has ever been this is the way we're going and it's once and done and you don't have to follow up on something new. You always have to follow up with people. So that's the get things done part of it. And again, these are all just sort of experiential in my life, and it was a way to group it for purposes of explaining it to others.
Debbie, that's powerful because that works in a small business. That works. You were leading 660,000 personnel with a $139 billion budget. That works in that environment as well, correct?
I think so. And I happen to believe that the basic principles, work in our personal lives as well, with our children, our parents, our friendships. I think these basic principles are universal that can help with pretty much any sort of challenge.
Speaking of challenges, what was the biggest budgetary challenge or any challenge for that matter at managing the Air Force?
I would say the most difficult parts of the job and the budgetary challenges were enormous, because even though we had seemingly enormous budgets, there are just so many needs and so many bill payers, so to speak. It's hard to bring it all together in a sensible way. But I'll give you the challenge, again, we all face it in our businesses and our lives, and that's navigating difficult relationships. So I would say the number one difficult relationship for me was dealing with Capitol Hill. So this is the executive branch dealing with senators, congressmen, their staffs. It pains me to say this because I was a Capitol Hill person for 10 years of my life earlier in my career, but it was a time where things were much more, I'll say, bipartisan and civil in communications back and forth. So how to navigate these very challenging conversations and try to get done the vast majority of what you're trying to get done while keeping your cool and keeping it civil, even when people around you may not be too cool and may not be too civil towards you. That was the most important thing.
I cannot imagine navigating those treacherous waters. It kind of brings me to a different topic. You were in the private sector, and then you're in the military and dealing with the public sector and all that stuff. How did you go from one to the other? I mean, how did you navigate? That's got to be complicated, right?
Well, times of transition usually are. And boy, it was a big transition going from, because I did the first 17 years of my life, my professional life, in the government. And here I was 38 or 39 years old, and I was at that point an assistant secretary of defense, which is pretty high level. I mean, that's pretty high up there too. And I thought, who in the world would ever give me the opportunity to do something bigger than this in government? Never. So let me get out of government now and go into the private sector because I'm still young enough. I can have a full career. This was my thinking. And so I went into the private sector thinking I was going to conquer the whole world, and pretty much fell flat on my face for the first 3 years because it was hard. The metrics by which you are judged in the private sector is different. The operational relationships are different. The private sector tends to be very flat and informal in their relationships, whereas in the military, government tends to be very command and control, very hierarchical. So just getting my own sort of rhythm, my own pace, learning these new metrics. I didn't have a business background. I had a couple of unlucky situations, I'll say, whereas most of my bosses throughout my life have been fantastic. I think I just ran into what we inevitably all run into, just some really difficult, hard to get along with people. And I just didn't seem to have the rapport. And so that was difficult. So for about 3 years, I really struggled and questioned, maybe this is not for me. Maybe the private sector was a mistake. Maybe I needed to go back into the government. But finally, I'll say the beginning of the 4th year, I hit my stride. I got into a different company, which I was introduced to that company thanks to another mentor in my life, a previous boss. So relationships are very, very important to keep up over time. And that's where I kind of hit my stride. And once again, I would say this was my period of reinvention, because I credit this 12-year period with this company called SAIC, where I really learned how to be a business person. I don't have an MBA, but I took rotational assignments to get different experiences. I took all the company training I could get my hands on. I asked for, and they allowed me to go to the University of Pennsylvania for a week, Columbia for a week, to take different short courses in finance and different types of things like that for executives. And so gradually over time, I was able to reinvent myself and become more of a business leader.
So you did recognize a huge difference, but you educated yourself to get new skills, new whatever it took to do that. What I picked up on there is continual learning, and Charlie Munger talks about that all the time. Continual learning. That's one of his things in poor Charlie's almanac, is the continual learning is always going to win.
Absolutely, especially nowadays. I mean, with technology that is moving at the speed of light and constantly changing, I think all of us would be well served to, even those of us who are not deep technologists or don't have science or engineering or mathematics degrees, to become reasonably conversant in the new technologies of today. Because if you don't engage in continual learning, if you don't continue to try to evolve and sometimes even reinvent yourself, I think you will tend to get left behind in some way. And by the way, if you're a deep technologist already, maybe you're a lousy communicator. Maybe you need to hone your skills in areas. Everybody is strong at something and everybody is weak at something. And so to understand, to be self-aware enough to know what those things are, and to always try to learn and evolve yourself in ways that you need to be beefed up. I'm a big believer in that.
So kind of the last question, that's a good segue, kind of the last question on this subject. You talked a lot about you have to have a certain level of IQ, right? But EQ, or emotional intelligence, where would you kind of rank that in terms of someone climbing to the level of success in either environment, whether it's the private sector or the government sector? You know, for someone aspiring to be as successful as you've become, how would you rank either one of those? I mean, there's a baseline intelligence that you just have to have. Getting lucky, you said that's part of it, and having the mentors. But there is the emotional intelligence. Some people are born with it, but some people, as you just mentioned, have to cultivate it. But where do you see that role?
Based on all my reading, and I would say based on my life experience, Gary, I would say, I'll put it in school terms. You do not have to be an A++ student when it comes to your IQ. Particularly, you don't have to be an A++ student to be a CEO or to be the Secretary of the Air Force or some very senior C-suite level or above position in life. You do have to be, I would say, a B student. You have to have enough of an IQ. You have to be competent, have competence in some element of the field that you are leading in, but you don't have to be A++. What you do need to be an A student on is your communication skills, your ability to manage across a matrix, because an awful lot of big companies now are in a matrix environment. So you have to have leadership skills that are more of the persuasion as opposed to the command and control. You know, you're going to want to follow my direction because you can see that it's in your own best interests, rather than follow my direction because I'm your boss and I can fire you if you don't follow my direction. You know, one's command and control and the other is more persuasion. So it's the relationships, it's the communication skills that become increasingly important. And there's where EQ is so important. There's where listening, there's where trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes and looking at it from their standpoint. If you can figure out, what do I need from them? What do they need from me? What maybe drives them? Are they driven by fear? Are they driven by ambition? Are they driven by, I just need my paycheck? You know, what drives them? To try to understand that and then come up with a win-win whereby I give you what you need, you give me what I need. That's a win-win. Now, see, that's what you all need to be.
Negotiating skills, right?
Right. And that's what's increasingly important the higher up you go. So a certain level of competence, I'm calling it a B student, maybe even a C student, but an A+ communicator, relationship person, ability to read the room, vision of where an organization ought to be headed for the future, things of that become very, very important the higher up you go.
Well, thank God C students can get ahead in this world. So I want to get into some of the other cooler parts of your job as a Secretary of the Air Force, but we'll have to wait until part 2. Also coming up next time, Debbie talks about the importance of being honest about your weaknesses.
So I'm a believer in know what your strengths are, know what your strengths are not, and then play to your strengths. You know, the fact that I'm really good at certain things, wow, I'm going to play to those areas. And then I'm going to try to surround myself with people to bring me up in areas that I'm less strong, because guess what? I'll learn from that and end up stronger, but the team will be the strongest of all.
To learn and practice the Success Paradox lifestyle, visit GaryCCooper.com. The Success Paradox is a production of Forbes Books.